Hi again, everyone. So welcome back. This is part two of my little sketch painting I'm doing today, titled A Little Corner in Rome. And if you watched the drawing segment before this, I discussed how I was taking this scene I saw in Rome and reinterpreting it, designing a more coherent pattern of lights and darks, to try to tell a little bit more of an experiential story that I felt when I was standing there. So the drawing segment is done. This is the reference photo. You can see next to the value design. So yes, as I was saying, I tried to design a center of focus here, which is the area of the painting in which all the highest contrast, the darkest darks, the lightest lights will happen, and then establish a pattern of light reading through the painting along a serpentine line surrounding the dominant vertical axis. So light, 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 reading all the way through along this vertical axis, pulling the viewer's eye up the stairway, telling a little bit of story, and interrupted only with this lounging, lazy black cat in the middle of the stairway. I also discussed how I could move the cat, take it out, change it up for a dog, but I just felt like the cat should stay. He's a little bit the star of the show, and I think his attitude speaks better to the emotional experience I had of the place than a human would, or even a dog. No offense, Otis. So I thought he was perfect. All that said, I honestly don't know if I've ever painted a cat, so this will be a first. I sketched him in, as you can see. He looks a little bit more like a mountain lion. I think it'll be okay. So color now. I have the lights and darks located thanks to my invaluable composition value design sketch. So what this tells me, more than any single thing else, is where not to paint. Don't paint where you want light. Where you want light in your painting, don't paint there. Save it. You can always go over it and get rid of it later if you need to, but it's pretty difficult to get it back or reclaim it once it is gone. So I'm just preparing my palette here. Again, I could change up the coloration from what I see here, but I just think this is very pleasing, this mottled collection of reddish salmon-colored painted plaster walls that have patina and are peeling. I want to capture some sense of that in my painting. And then this scruffy, unkempt surround of greenery, I think, obviously the red-green complement family works, and it sets up a little electricity in the painting that I want to use to my advantage. So, while, yeah, I could change it, I don't want to change it too much. At least that's one of the things that attracted me to painting this. As far as actual colors, what I'm using, this is some permanent orange. I'm using Holbein light red and a little bit of Daniel Smith Mayan orange. Slightly brighter and less earthy than, say, a burnt sienna. I'm trying to, I don't need to be absolutely literal to what's actually there, but I want to be, in the ballpark. So I'm using an Escoda flat brush is what I was using there. Just the reason is it's easier to cut in around corners and edges, sure, but also it's much easier to do these kind of dry brush techniques where you can leave a lot of these skip marks And I want a lot of patina and texture and scruffiness here on purpose. I don't want these walls to look like they were painted yesterday. I want them to look sort of intentionally messy, if you will. So into that base warm wash, I'm dropping in a little bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit more of the Mayan orange. And again, I'm not trying to be overly literal, but just to get the feeling of it, I think that's not bad. The top of the stairs, I want to save a little bit of glint of light there to help pull the viewer in through. So I don't want to get rid of all that light, but I want to knock it back a little bit just at the very top. Again, the flat brushes are just so ideal for that kind of textural look that I happen to love. I am very compelled by this. I usually hide my reference photo, but I just do love the modeling and the cool tones that are reading through. So before this dries too much, I'm going to drop in little bits of cool tonalities, probably just some cobalt blue, I think will be simple. No need to overdo it, but just that idea is kind of great. I get asked a lot if I paint on wet paper or dry paper. I'll confess I'm a little confused by that question. I think a lot of people are perhaps, I'm guessing, have been taught somehow to wet your entire paper and then paint on it. That is a way to paint. Nothing wrong with it. It is not the way I paint. Because if you want to maintain an edge anywhere at all, here, etc., if the whole paper is wet, you can just say goodbye to any edges. You're not going to have them. The wet paint will run across the wet areas, and then you can't preserve any edge. And I'm asked if I paint wet in wet or not. And again, I'm a little confused by that question. Sure, I do areas of wet and wet. That's all wet and wet. But the overall initial attack was not. It was wet on dry. I want this whole painting to look very fresh and loose and free. That's just the whole point of this. So I'm going to try very hard to get the values more or less correct without having to glaze over or go back and revisit anything. So I want to get the values as correct as I can initially. And yeah, if you do it right the first time, you won't have to go back and do it again. Here I'll go back and darken that when this dries up a little bit. So far, so good. These really dark bits are some Imperial Purple, Daniel Smith, and some neutral tint, just to get really dark really quickly, sort of in the violet family. It's been raining so much here. Not really complaining. I like the rain and we need it, but also it gives me more studio time, which isn't bad. This is a 1/2 inch flat. It's actually a very cheap-ish brush, all synthetic, which has its advantages because really synthetic brush will run out of water more quickly, and you can get a lot of these scrapey marks that I love so much. Whereas an all-natural bristled brush is going to retain more water, and you can do dry brush with them, of course, but not with such ease as you can with the synthetic. Overall, this painting approach I'm doing is, I call it carving light. I have identified where I want my main light in the reference photo in my value design sketch, composition sketch. So what I'm doing now is just painting everything that is not that, knocking back all the areas of the painting except where I want to save the light. It makes all kinds of sense to me, and hopefully it will to you too. This wall behind is a little bit darker. I'm using this 3/4 inch flat here just to save a little thread of light on the top of that angled wall. That's a smaller element, but this angled energy will help tie into this light bit stepping down the stairway in a very compelling way. We hope that's the intent. I want a lot of patina and texture on everything here, and I want the whole painting to look, well, obviously I want it to look good, but I want it to look kind of intentionally messy. This sort of analog feeling of patinaed walls and the ravages of time. And the best way I think that I can get there is by nailing these values and colors at least pretty close first try, and a lot of this dry brush technique. This kind of thing helps as well, allowing some lost and found edges and bits of one tonality and one value to wash organically into another. It's very, very much the vocabulary of watercolor, and I love it in general, but for this specific painting, I think it's really the way to go. This part of the wall is quite wet, so wet and wet, I'm just dropping some, trying to be very casual about it, and just dropping in some tonalities so that it looks mottled and old. Still a little bit luminous, not entirely the darkest dark yet, but getting there pretty quick. There are a number of these terracotta pots sitting around. Again, I could leave them out. I don't have to draw them just because they show up in the reference photo, but I do like them, and I think they add to the sort of homey, human, casual feeling of the whole place. So I'm not being utterly literal about their placement or size, but I am showing them. I think it's important. One of the most beautiful qualities of watercolor, I think, when it's successful, is the organic way that one element sort of connects to or almost becomes another element, if that makes sense. One thing just grows into another in a beautifully organic, natural-looking way that I just... I suppose you can do similar things in other painting mediums, but I just don't find them as convincingly beautiful as they are in watercolor. I'm very, very, very moved by the idea of contrast. I don't just mean light and dark, although I do, but in addition, two opposite things meeting on the surface of the paper and finding some kind of resolution. So warm and cool tones, vertical, horizontal, diagonal energies, the idea of the past and the present, the man-made world versus the natural, and then the whole idea of the thing and what is not the thing. So the solid and the void, space and object, I find really, really compelling ideas for painting in general. And because of watercolor's fluidity by design and its ability to allow one thing to just grow organically into another, I just find that for me, it's the medium that works best. I designed this shadow pattern on the steps coming down that's not necessarily that accurate, and it doesn't show up in the reference photo because the light that day was very indirect, I think an overcast day. So I'm just designing a light pattern, and to that end, a shadow pattern. I don't have to do that, but it's going to be a really easy way for me to inject this contrast, some edges and some contrast into my center of focus, some lights versus some darks. So to that degree, yeah, I think I have to do this. I'm compelled to do it. I don't usually draw in shadows, but here I am because in the center of focus, I want them to be just a little bit more graphic than they are elsewhere in the painting, perhaps. Right, okay. Shadow colors. I get asked a lot, what color are shadows? Can't really answer that because there is no answer. Shadows don't necessarily have a color. There's certainly in your painting not a right color or a wrong color to paint shadows. It depends on what looks good in your painting, which is sort of a perfectly non-answer answer, but it's true. Often the shadow color is a version of the material color upon which it falls. So if a shadow falls against a very warm object, the shadow color might be a darker version of that color. But then you have to say, okay, but does it look good in my painting? And if the answer is yes, well, then that's your answer. But if the answer is no, then it's not. Also, because in watercolor, we don't paint the light. The light is there. It's on the surface of the paper, shining through. What we paint are the shadows and shades that give light its identity. So to that end, I just find shadow colors an area where you can go a little bit wild. They can include bits of refracted and reflected light. All kinds of light effects are in shadows. If you're anything like me and very spacey and a constant tourist of the world, which I am, I stare up at shadows all the time, especially in cities, because you can just see the effects of shadows perhaps a little bit better. But anyway, within shadows, often, especially in a warmer climate, perhaps there are bits of them that will have quite warm tones leaking through. It can be very beautiful. A little bit depends on the physical size of the shadow. If it's a very big, deep, long shadow, then you can get away with dropping in some very unexpected bright colors within shadows. Here I'm dropping in a little bit of this same warm that was I used for the wall over there. The base shadow I'm using here is, I think, an ultramarine blue. But I'm really doing that because I need the deepness of the value. I want the luminosity of the blue, but I do want this warm, cool bounce. Again, that's another contrast I referenced earlier that I'm always looking for in my work is constant series of expected and unexpected contrasts. But warm and cool tones are just one of the easiest and most effective ways for the painter to get there. So when I'm asked what color this or that is, it often, quite honestly, doesn't matter. A better question is it dark or is it light? Or secondarily, is it warm or is it cool? What's the actual color often doesn't really matter too much to me. So really what I'm painting here, I often don't put my darkest darks in my painting till very near the end, but a bit of an exception here just because I know the stairway is going to be largely saved white and I want to connect this shadow to what I'm doing there. So I'm just moving ahead and dropping in some fairly dark tones for the shadow here relatively early on. As you can see, it's reminiscent of the reference photo, but certainly not a copy. I avoid, whenever I can, using just dull grays for shadows. Because we don't paint the light in our work, and we really only paint the shadows in our paintings are often the only place where we can inject any life and any color. So I think you gotta think long and hard before you just paint a shadow, a murky Payne's gray or indigo or something sad and lifeless. You've got a once-in-a-lifetime chance to use some beautiful luminous color, and if it makes sense, why not do so? The other thing I'm doing here is trying to design as I'm painting just this hopefully interesting pattern of almost abstract shapes, like a little abstract painting in the middle of my overall painting. So I have kind of a general game plan for this area, but I don't really have a plan. I'm doing what I hope looks good on the painting and not worrying too much about so-called reality, or definitely not worried about literal representation. Okay, as we get further down the stairway, obviously we're getting a little farther from the center of focus, not too far yet, but because of that I can just begin to think about lightening up some of these tones, becoming a little less graphic. Having a hard time seeing what the heck I drew. I guess it doesn't matter that much. The smaller brush I'm using is, I'll link and reference all the materials I'm using down in the description, but it's one of a series of mop brushes that I use that were made for me by the Neef, N-E-E-F, the Neef Brush Company out of Australia. Fantastic brush manufacturers. But yes, I have my own signature series. They were really great. They worked with me to develop these. They are mops in the sense that they hold loads of water, and you can In the smaller version, they act almost like riggers. You can do very fine lines if you want. They hold a point beautifully. They're synthetic, but they mimic the behavior of all natural hair, such as a squirrel brush, just because of the way they're designed and manufactured. They are synthetic, so no squirrels were harmed in the production. Okay, so I got a little fussy there, but I needed to. This wall I'm going to save out as completely unpainted at this point. As I get further into the painting,